No, Hilary. just whether you have anything to say.
But it doesn't make sense to anymore.
Not just
So I'll just like, yeah, I'll start. Should I?
yeah, just quickly.
Okay. Bueno, vamos a comenzar. Bueno, good morning, everybody. Buenos días, todos y todas. Yo creo que arrancamos. I think we should start. Para el día de hoy, de mañana, tenemos programado sesión que trata de explorar un poco más las conexiones literales sobre la literatura, sobre conocimiento. Y también en el fin de esta mañana, de esta sesión de la mañana, vamos a hablar un poquito más sobre las posibilidades de perspectivas inter o transdisciplinarias. ¿Sí? So today, this morning, we are going to have a focus, or we start with focusing more on another dimension of these dialogues and connections, namely about literature and exploring different possibilities of comparing literature or work in literary field. And then we will finish with more discussion about the possibilities of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome here and I give a word to Gilbert Shang, who is at the moment a visiting professor at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá. And previously he has worked at Bixas in Bayreuth. So in a sense, he's a great example of these connections, and we very much look forward for the presentation, which will be about what's called comparative literature, reimagining post-war dispensations in multi-ethnic context in Congo and Peru through the novels of Alonso Cueto and the novel called Laura Azul and Julian Quilanga, Jardín Secret. Es un gran placer presentar a Gilbert Shang, que está trabajando en la Universidad de los Andes como profesor visitante y también antes estaba estudiando y trabajando en Bixas, en la Universidad de Bayreuth. Entonces, yo paso la palabra a Gilbert. De nuevo, muchas gracias por aceptar la invitación.
Thank you very much, Jean-Gilles. It's my pleasure to be here in Cali. And I want to also thank not just you, but also your entire team, including Rosa, whom we know each other for some time now, thanks to this cooperation. And also old friends like Julian that I've been able to meet, in this encounter. So thanks very much. For me, it's a wonderful opportunity. And the exchanges so far have been very enriching. Yes, as the title entiles, my presentation is actually about literatures of violence in particular. And my, let me say, case study is actually Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, or supposedly Democratic Republic of Congo, and Peru. So one country in Central Africa and one in Andean Latin America. And I'm looking at the novels of Alonso Cueto, quite a renowned Peruvian author. The novel is Laura Azul, or The Blue R, and that of the Congolese author and professor Julien Quilanga Mosinde. And within it's actually a very broad piece of work that I've almost completed. And I'm looking not just at contemporary violence, but also getting right deep into the history of these two spaces at the really colonial time. So it's a very broad study. And previously, I've also looked at not just somatic epic violence, but also economic violence through novels that deal more with, economic issues, but which entails violence too, because we have to look at violence from different perspectives. So today I'm looking actually at, within the theme of this encounter, issues of ethnicity and racism, and I want to look at what kind of visions actually emerge from post-war novels that can enrich our understanding of, issues of race and ethnicity. And I begin my postulations from, uh, you know, ideas from previous authors and theoreticians who have worked on the issues of violence. And someone like Theodore Adorno once postulated that after Auschwitz, for example, there was no possibility of writing poetry anymore. The evil of the violence was so hard that even in literary creativity, nothing could be written. It was beyond writing. And Susan Sontag also says almost the same thing in her appraisal of the works of Henry James about the First World War, that the war had used up words. There was no word remaining to describe what had just happened, the Great War. But the most eloquent expression of this post-war trauma, and with regards to questions of writing, literary creativity, is by none other than the famous German cultural critic, Walter Benjamin, who says in one of his works, The Storyteller, he says about the Great War, the First World War, as a parameter, as a paradigm of how war shook the very basis of humanity. He says, a generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds. And beneath these clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body. So Walter Benjamin really wanted us to look at the issue of the recognition of the human, how that very idea of the human was destroyed. And that's why he describes the human body as fragile, this vulnerability of the human body due to violence. So I'm analyzing my works based on these previous, postulations about writing in post-war times. And my arguments are the following: that creative reproductions of the harrowing experiences of violence and war have the possibility of opening up a window of opportunity for a radical reconsideration of the ethical basis of our society. And secondly, that beyond being mere response to epic somatic violence, literary works can also foreground, self and other dynamics of everyday life that tackles less visible but nevertheless insidious forms of violence that threaten social equilibrium and sense of belonging in a given polity. Which means that I'm not looking only at the very somatic and epic, but I'm looking at how that very dramatized or dramatic violence also connects with less, or let's say less somatic and less epic forms of violence, but nevertheless they are interconnected. And sometimes the very less dramatic is what really, in the long run causes the total conflagration of society into open violence. So I would give previously a kind of rundown of what these novels are about. And I give that rundown under, the caption of redrawing the cartography of the nation in a situation of coloniality through, the construction of space in the novel. Why do I choose this? Because if you notice, I think we are going to go, deep into the history of this violence, but I think during discussions, Peru and Congo, I won't use up my time really getting into the history that much. But if you look at the spaces in which this violence occurred in both spaces, this were national crises per se, but some regions, in the case of Peru, the Andean regions were the most, affected by the war. And in Peruvian literary imaginations, a space like Ayacucho has come to represent that very space, of memory with regard to the violence. While in the case of the Congo, my focus is actually on the first and the second Congolese war, which actually took place mostly, let's say, in the eastern part of the country. And in Congolese literary works, the Kivus, also come to represent the very space of violence, which means that in these countries, because of the deep divide, spatial divide, the nation is not imagined holistically. And I come to that by saying that when the violence began in Peru in the 1980s, it took a long time for those in the metropolitan towns like Lima to really come to terms that something was happening. Of course, they got the news, but it was like a different country to them. And it posed the question of what I call the colonial geography of sympathy. That people were being killed, it was in the news, but it didn't mean anything much until in the mid 80s when the violence started hitting also Lima and other big towns, and that's where the Peruvian middle class and upper middle class actually began taking stock that there was something shaking this country. In the case of Congo too, there's a kind of discrepancy between on the way people understand the drama of violence in the Congo. There's a kind of cleavage between those in the East who have really witnessed the theaters of war, and Bukavu, places like Goma, actually like very iconic spaces of this violence. So sometimes you have a kind of discrepancy between them and those in Kinshasa who might not feel very concerned with what is happening in the East in that sense. So the way Alonso Cueto shapes his story is quite telling, because he narrates the life of a lawyer, Adrian Omache, whose father was a commander in the war in Ayacucho, was a military commander. So on his dying bed, Comandante Omache asked his son to go to Ayacucho and look for one specific girl with whom he had contact when he was fighting the war in Ayacucho. And so this becomes a kind of, when he dies, Adrian Omache is so involved in his profession, he doesn't take his father's last words very seriously. But when his mother died too, because they had divorced, that's when Adrian Omache discovers that a network of people were extorting money from his mother on account that they were going to reveal to the press what her husband, of course divorced, but the family name was quite important, what Comandante Omache did in Ayacucho. So he wants to dismantle that network, which is extortion, because his father's former comrades actually were part of that network to extort around $1,000 from the mother every month, menacing, threatening her that if she doesn't give that amount, they're going to reveal the story of what the husband did during the war theater in Ayacucho. So when the mother died is when Adrian Omache decides to go right down to Ayacucho looking for this girl whom his father talked about. And so that trip, the journey motif, is what really makes him to come out of his upper middle class status, really being caged in in some of the most sumptuous and posh quarters of Lima, and then going to see exactly what Peru is about, and really the theater, what happened in the 80s and the 90s. And so that traveling motif actually is what opens him up, and he starts looking at Peru from a different perspective. And so he makes a lot of encounters in Ayacucho and comes out with a sense of guilt, a guilt for the fact that he discovers that his father had raped this girl. So many things happen in the war in Peru. A lot of rape, incidents happen. Some reported and some still not reported. So he discovers this very devastating crime by the father, and it starts haunting him. And he starts thinking about what to do with this girl. So the face of that girl starts being a kind of a permanent presence in his mind, and he sees her in his dreams, he sees her in his phantasms, and that is how he starts understanding what other people went through during the war. And he met a certain girl in Ayacucho who tells him about what life was in Ayacucho in the 80s and the 90s. And she tells him, no one here thinks being alive is something normal. Here, they have always looked at life with astonishment. Have you ever thought about what humility means, about what it means to be ordinary, to be poor, to be humble simply in order to stay alive? Can you even begin to imagine that? So, life in Ayacucho is painted because the Ayacucho is like the heartland of the Andean population, who are the majority numerically, but seen as the order in Peru by the ruling class in Lima. So this experience actually tells us, in terms of the decolonial criticism about what Fanon calls conditions of unlife, in the same country, but those in Ayacucho and the Andean hinterlands were living even before the war and during the war, what we can call through Fanonian thought, conditions of unlife, um, underlined by the coloniality of power, in which the colonized order perceives life not as a flowering or productive process, but rather as a permanent struggle against an omnipresent death, experienced as endemic famine, unemployment, a high death rate, and inferiority complex. So this is exactly what life was. Omache, through his trip to Ayacucho, understands that Peru has different cartographies of the nation of Peru. It's a very divided and segmented nation. So that the discrepancy is quite much. The structural violence that actually dates far back to colonial times has completely, prevented mutual respect, within the Peruvian citizenry. And the author uses this metaphor of rape, by the father of Adrian Omache during the war, to some sort of talk also about the historical rape, actually, from the very, colonial encounter, the historical rape of the Andean order by the conquering Spaniards. So this is just, he uses this instance of rape in the epic somatic war of the 80s and 90s to show a much broader picture of historical rape that dates as far back as the first, colonial arrivals in the Andean heartland. And this situation of unlife that was witnessed in many parts of Peru, where the violence occurred, was recognized because after the war there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru, as I think some of you know, and it was quite comprehensive report about the war and the causes, the immediate and also the distant causes, the historical causes. And this is what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission says about life in Ayacucho and with the kind of conditions that made military uprising very palatable to the indigents of that place. The commission recognized that apart from the ethnic and racial marginalization, despise, and age-old oppression, state neglect, and the growing poverty of the recent years, most of the Andean majorities and Amazonian minorities were victims of grave crimes and human rights violations. So these are the conditions that actually made these societies, Ayacucho in particular, but also regions like Ancash and Apurimac, really indigenous parts of Peru that are that way, according to the national rating, are the poorest part of Peru. And also, these are the areas where the War of the Shining Path in Peru had greatest violence, greatest victims. Most of those who really lost their lives away in this part. And an aspect that shows clearly that the cartography of nation, of belonging, of citizenship in Peru was quite problematic and still is the fact that it took the upper middle class in Lima and the government authorities several years after the end of the violence, which is officially is from 1980 to 2000. At first, the estimate of the victims were close to 35,000 victims. But when the commission actually, launched the investigation and sent people to the field, it was discovered that that number was just half of what had actually occurred. So people died and it wasn't taken to be anything. So it's like these numbers come from somewhere, but this was a reality. Part of the citizenry of Peru was being massacred with the sheer ignorance or intentional, lack of knowledge by the governing class and the military authorities. So the Andean part of Peru became like the Oriental order, where military men committed crimes and came back to Lima and led their normal lives, and nothing was done. And these realities were only revealed during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That is as far as the summary of the novel Laura Azul is concerned. Let me say something about that of Julien Kilanga, Le Jardin Secret. This novel is located. The setting is not explicitly stated, but from the geography and the history of the imaginary space that Kilanga describes, you can easily pin it down to the Congo. And the plot is quite simple. But let me say something about, around the period when this novel was written. That is 2010. It was written at a point where Congo was supposedly a post-war country. After the conflagrations of the first Congo War, 96, 97, and then the second and most lethal second Congolese War, 1998 to 2002, that led to the death of Laurent Kabila, and his son Joseph Kabila took over and formed a transitory government. And there were some hopes that at least Congo is going to come over this history of war. But this was not the case. And what Julian Kilanga describes in this novel is that even though the official military war has ended, there was a war of greed in the transitional government, in Kinshasa. And that if things continued in that way, violent uprisings were actually going to erupt again in the Congo. And this is not the only novel that actually sees war from that mitigated perspective. That war in the Congo is not just the use of arms, but that the culture of graft amongst the intellectual class actually is another form of war in the Congo. Of course, that makes it difficult for you to ever talk of war in the Congo, even the epic violence, without the economic side of it. They have always gone together. We know very well that the war in the Congo is self-sustained because, at the same time, the war is going on, even international multinationals are exploiting coltan and all these, riches at the same time. Some of them actually sponsoring the war in the Congo. So Kilanga gives a different perspective to the notion of war. Although the military war has ended, Congo is facing another form of war by the members of the new transitional government, amongst whom are intellectuals. So he really makes a critique of the intellectual class of the Congo, that these are people who are supposed to be the conscience of the nation, but they are very much the ones involved in this graft. So in his novel, he pictures an intellectual, Mwanda, who is being courted by a rebel leader in the eastern part of Congo, which one can identify to be Bukavu, where like the violence still erupted in the Congo in 2007. And this rebel leader wants the intellectual to become the spokesperson of his movement, and he resists because of his conscience. He had also earlier rejected appointment by the government of the fictional president, which one can also identify as Joseph Kabila. He wants to be a civil society actor, but in some way, the rebel leader kidnaps him from a town around Kinshasa and takes him to the eastern part of the country. And that's where he gets to also appreciate what happens, which somebody living in Kinshasa wouldn't know. He gets to really meet the situation of what war has done to the eastern part of the Congo, especially North and South Kivu. But he discovers that the woman whom the rebel leader had sent to kidnap him actually is his niece, who migrated to the east. And so in that encounter, he discovers that he is actually the uncle to the lady who was sent by the rebel leader to kidnap him. And so the encounter between the intellectual and the rebel is very interesting as to the philosophy of war and peace. The rebel leader prefers peace prefers war to peace, and the intellectual says, no, we've been down this road and it hasn't helped us. So that face-to-face encounter is what I use the works of Emmanuel Levinas to analyze the face-to-face encounter with the enemy, which I will come to that as I discuss. Let me also say that these are the kind of tropes that I found very similar in the two texts, because at the same time as the face-to-face encounter between Adrian Omache, the son of the rapist, and the woman whom his father raped is quite interesting, and that the face of the victimized other becomes a haunting figure, and he's trying to grapple with the crime of his father. And this is how he describes his experience with that face. Once during the weekly office meetings, I thought I saw her. We are in the hills above Ayacucho. It's dark, but I can see her. Light plays on her body. She asks me to follow her. She's naked and moves in great looping strides as though she's flying. It appears to me several times, and with a different voice. It watches me, neither with love nor hate, but with a sheer indifference that excites me. He tries to when he finally meets this woman, he tries to interview her about what the father actually did to her, but she prefers to remain silent. And this tells us the bigger picture of what happened actually in Peru. Most of the victims of rape didn't want to tell a story, and so the stories themselves became inaccessible to whosoever wanted to listen, because the victim was afraid that the story could be misconstructed by the author, as is most often in post-colonial situations, and that's exactly what Spivak talks about. Can the subaltern speak? Because most often what she says would end up being misused or misinterpreted. So she prefers to remain silent, and this is the kind of silence that Edward Said talks about. And in the case of the oppressed people of Palestine, that sometimes when he goes home and wants to talk to his people of Palestine, they have a very elusive silence, the silence that are characteristics of histories of untellable abjection. It's beyond narration. So Adrian Omache is unable to get the true story of what actually happened to this lady who was violated by his father. And also, the face-to-face encounter can also be seen in the story of Julian Kilanga, where the intellectual Mwanda tells Safi, who turns out to be his niece, that you need to put me face to face with my enemy, with the rebel leader. And so this aesthetics of face to face is quite important in the colonial studies, and this linkage is made by the French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who says in one of his texts about the author that I, as an ethical subject, must go beyond care for my own being and give myself away for the sake of the other. Ethics is thus a matter of a gift without an ontological origin or goal, of a gift without reservation and limit, of a gift that has no common measure with an intersubjective exchange or an invisibility shared by different finite subjects. So this is quite interesting, because Manuel Levinas propounded a theory of ethics that was contrary to what Heidegger had propounded in terms of the Daseins. And so he thought that Heidegger's ideas of subjectivity were very much attuned with fascism, the very conquering I. And so he replaced ontology and epistemology as first philosophy with ethics. That ethics has to come before ontology, because the human subject is at its very base intersubjective. There is no I without the you, without the other person. So that is the kind of aesthetics of post-war reconstruction, getting to know the other, getting to observe the face of the other as being part of the subject himself. And, you know, one can actually see this too, you know, even in the way, Alonso Cueto, you know, foregrounds his representation. He does not only talk about the face of the other in terms of the woman whom his father raped, but also photography becomes part of his aesthetics, because he gets the picture of the father and also try to find himself in that image, and some sort of to identify, but also some sort of dissociate himself with the image of his father, who is the violator. So it is not clear. It is still like a work in progress, because the face of neither of his, you know, neither of his father nor that of the violated lady is accessible. So getting to know the face of the other is is not a finished act. It's always a work in progress. Trying to understand the other, because the other too is quite elusive, and you can't ever appropriate the face of the other. But it is in the acceptance of that difference that you get to, you know, to build an intersubjective ethics of the self. It is not because you can be able to appropriate the selves, but the fact that that phase is, in as much as you identify itself, you can never objectify that phase that actually, you know, constitutes the aesthetics of post-war peace in the works of Alonso Cueto in particular. And another issue that is handled in these post-war novels is the fact that it is very possible that subjects pass from being victims of war to victims of peace. It sounds ironical, but this is what happens when the peace accord and peace treaties don't take, you know, adequate stock of the positions of marginal subjects. Then they can pass from being victims of the somatic epic violence to being victims of peace. So while we think also of victims of violence, we should think about the victims of the peace, which sometimes it's actually longer term. It's actually more on long term. This is, for example, I will quote a passage in the book of the novel of Alonso Cueto. For example, his brother, who lives in the United States, wants to come back to Lima. Of course, it is post-war, so he thinks there's peace in Peru. And his imagination of the kind of life that he will live in Peru actually means that the same dynamics of othering, you know, it's not over even with the war, because he says he wants to come back to Peru and settle with a Chola woman. Now in Peru, Chola, I think some of you know, I've not met that concept in Colombia yet, but I don't know whether it exists. But Bolivia and Peru, the word Cholo and Chola, it's a very problematic identity straitjacketing. These are mestizos that are some sort of much more connected with their Andean cultures than, you know, the very urban Creole society. Of course, they are hybrids, but they are othered as being much more, you know, linked to the Andean, underdeveloped, and also, you know, speak Spanish in a particular way, or they are Quechua speaking. So the brother of Adrian Omache says he wants to come back to, he wants to come that, so I will quote him. That is why one of these days I am going to take my wad of cash, come back here and buy a little farm with down in the Lorin Valley somewhere, keep chickens and sheep, just a little place with a couple of animals, and I will sip my beer and watch TV, get myself a good Chola woman who will take care of me and cook for me. I mean, so in this case, he's talking about a woman he's going to marry, but the way he talks about the Chola woman means it's not going to be a relation of equality. The Chola woman is like being conquered by the male, and one cannot foresee a viable marital situation of reciprocity in this situation. So that is why one of the authors that I read, who has written a very interesting book on trauma, post-war and trauma, says we should create a connection between the survivors of vast concentration camps created by tyrants who ruled their nations, and also survivors of small hidden concentration camps created by those who ruled their homes. So there's a connection between micro forms of subjectification and the macro ones that we find through war. So this is how post-war novels actually function, not only looking at the very epic and dramatic forms of violence, but also looking at other forms of violence that might pass unnoticed, but that they are also but that are also very insidious, and uh, and that constitute forms of othering of the other. And so this is how Nelson Maldonado Torres, one of the proponents of the decolonial theory, looks at even moments of peace treaties or post-war reconciliation, that sometimes it tends to have a very masculine dimension. And he said it can somewhat be limited by its reliance on problematic conceptions of sex and gender. After all, fraternity primarily denotes a community of brothers. To combat the ideology of war, it is necessary to recognize the extent to which it is the product of a masculine ethos of struggle. That is why war typically reinforces discourses about the limit of the feminine. It also tends to reduce the role of women to the care of the wounded and to reproduction. In war, men kill other men and rape the enemy's women. Violence finds another place in the subordination of every woman to the role of reproduction. So this is actually, as we all know, and something that was very peculiar about these two situations of war was rape. Rape was instrumentalized. It became a very great tool of war. The case of the Congo, I think, is actually well known to a lot of people here, and so a lot of authors post-war authors in Congo focus really on the plight of the women in Eastern Congo, some of whom have been damaged both physically and psychologically. And unlike Peru, where you had a true process of reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission really did a great job. Of course, not all the recommendations of the committee members were implemented, but at least there was a process of healing in Peru, which it's still problematic, but at least there was a forum of catharsis where women came up with, tales of rape and all that. In Congo, it's a bit difficult. There hasn't been a clear official accountability system. And so most writers from Eastern Congo in particular, like Jean Nkoli Bofan in his work Congo Inc., and Charles Jungos Simba in his work Clouds on Bukavu, actually focused on these women who were at the same time wives of rebel leaders in a kind of something you could say a proper marriage, but they really had no option because either you were killed or you were adopted as the wife of the rebel leader. And this is what happens to the female character in the works in the novel by Julien Kilanga, who actually becomes, the kind of wife of the rebel leader. And so this is how most of the post-war novels actually try to look at these different, different forms of violence. Of course, they are written after the very traumatic ones, but they look at the other micro forms of violence that would mean that some peace treaties don't have meaning to certain segment of the society because they haven't addressed issues that are pertinent to them, for example. And the ideology of the face-to-face, of being able to confront your enemy, be it in the face of, in the case of Alonso Cueto, where it is the son of the rapist who confronts, the victim of the father, or be it in the case of Julien Kilanga, with whom, in which case the intellectual pacifist confronts the rebel leader who thinks war should be the option to take to redeem Congo. that face-to-face encounter is an aesthetics that is very common in both contexts in terms of post-war reconciliation. And a paradigmatic example of this kind of face-to-face is, codified in a very famous poem by Wilfred Owen, First World War, really very important British war poet, who, in his poem Strange Meeting, paints a First World War situation whereby two enemy soldiers in search of refuge find themselves in the same dark trench underground. They have lost their arms and they have only their military uniforms, and this one knows you are my enemy. And they meet and they're enemies, but they're armless. That's when they recognize that, that they are all human. And one says to the other, "Strange friend, here is no cause to mourn." "None," said the other, "save the undone years, the hopelessness. Whatever hope is yours was my life also. I am the enemy you killed, my friend. I knew you in this dark." So the poem has a series of oxymorons and paradoxes. Strange friend, a friend that is at the same time strange, and I am the enemy you killed. That's the war logic. I'm the enemy you killed. So it's by chance that you and I are face to face. But had it been otherwise, you would have killed me. And again, the fact that I knew you in the dark, it is in that dark trench that he gets to know the face of the other. This underlines, the imperative of this interpersonal, intersubjective relationship between humanity. That even though they belong to different camps, it is when they find themselves in this vulnerable situation that they recognize their humanity. And this is one aspect too that comes out in terms of post-war literary ethics, turning vulnerability into strength. As in the case of Walter Benjamin that I cited, up front, he said, of course, war destroyed any forms of literary language, but still literature was a viable form through which we could express the desire for a better society. So we still had to write literature, but what kind of aesthetics, was post-war literature going to take? This is what every post-war author, a question which every post-war author has to answer. And I think we've still been able to see wonderful productions of literary works in post-war situations with a different aesthetics, with different ethics, really radically reconstructing society through literary works. And that is exactly what Walter Benjamin in his autobiography, Berliner Kindheit, really says. The politics to come is fundamentally predicated on a radical openness towards and even hope for the other. So it is really in that politics of getting to, to step in the place of the other that the world can survive this post-war trauma. So this is the kind of aesthetics that I found also in the works that I've just analyzed above. But I would conclude with some major points that post-war literature so addresses forms of, really dramatic violence, but also the way violence has taken refuge in discourses, in speeches, in words, in nocturnal passing of unjust laws, in cultural and post-colonial dispensations that transgress the rights of the citizens. And this is exactly what I was talking about, addressing also the most minute, seemingly minute forms of violence, sometimes even engraved in peace treaties that leave more victims, even post-war victims, than victors. And that also, an element that runs through the text that I've just analyzed, and many more that I analyzed in my entire corpus, is the fact that post-war literature is also very self-reflexive. And it's because violence is something you cannot narrate, you cannot objectify. And this is why I thought it wise to follow and read novels written by people from these places affected by the violence. In the case of Peru, I I sought to, there's a very enormous literary production in Peru linked to the war. It's really enormous and really works of very wonderful quality. But it's important for anybody working on Peruvian literature not only to focus on the works written by authors like Alonso Cueto, who are, upper middle class Creole Lima-based authors, but also getting to know what people from Ayacucho have written about the war. Because there's a kind of a conflict in Peru, usually in terms of visibility, that authors from the Andean parts of the country where the war actually took place don't usually get that visibility because there's a whole industry of publication. Who writes the reviews? Where are the works validated through literary prizes? Sometimes those who write from the hinterlands where the war took place don't get this accessibility. And there's been a kind of conflict between what Peruvians call literatura pituca, literature by the upper middle class in Peru who write about the war. And sometimes they don't really get to, to understand what caused the war and end up rehashing government naming of those who fought on the side of the Sendero as just terrorist youth. But those who write from the position of spaces like Ayacucho, Cusco have a more mitigated way of looking at in which those who actually fought in this war were they just desperate youth or they really had a cause, and sometimes they want to also humanize people whom the government had simply dismissed as teruco. Teruco is a word in Peru that means in those difficult years means terrorist. It's a combination of Quechua and terrorista. And it came to a point where anybody from Ayacucho or Quechua speaking youth could be just called teruco or teruca if you were a female. And so this kind of othering has been really very problematic, even in post-war situations in Peru. So that's why most of the novels get to be very reflexive and sometimes even autobiographical. An example is Criba by Julian Huaranca, that I also handle, and also that of Oscar Cochado. And even these texts that I treated, Ora Azul also has a very, you can see outlines of also autobiographical or authorial intrusion because Alonso Cueto also being an upper middle class, professor in the Catholic University of Peru, like belonging to that class, and also trying to understand the situation that his country went through, which perhaps also his socialization networks shielded him from. So it's also a way of understanding the self in post-war literature, because one cannot distance himself from what happened in the country. So the novel also begins to be a kind of self-reflexive medium of understanding, of putting into question one's imagination of one's nation. That is very key in most of the books that I actually handle. And this is in line with what Gayatri Spivak talks about, understanding our privilege as our loss. That because you are over there, you need to some sort of, dissociate yourself with the habitus of your class status to actually get to know what the nation of Peru means to those who live in San Juan de Lurigancho, part of Lima where war victims actually migrated, when the war was over. So these are parts of Peru that have a completely different temporality from the rest of the, Miraflores and where the Pitucos and Pitucas actually live. So the post-war authors, being most of them from the upper class, always try to question their own knowledge about the country and also try to look back perhaps to why they also were indifferent. So it's also a kind of mea culpa of the upper class, those who produce this kind of literature. It's the same thing in the Congo. Julien Kilanga, a university professor, who also, because I've talked to him personally, he went through a similar experience by being some sort of kidnapped, taken to the eastern part of the Congo. He is from Lubumbashi. So he got to, is when he went to the eastern part of the country that he got to know what life is like in North Kivu, in South Kivu, in Goma, in Bukavu. So these are characteristics of post-colonial nations, that there are different segments within what we call the nation. The nation is understood through very different categories. And also, the trope of the family actually is very important. As we see, Adrian Omache wants to consider the lady raped by his father as part of his family, because that is, and also the lady get a child. So he wants to adopt the child as part of the family, meaning that, even the Andean order that has been so, oppressed in Peru has to be considered as part of the Peruvian, because it's part of the Peruvian, history. It's a history of métissage and hybridity. So everyone has to feel as belonging to that ethic. So, and also in the case of Julien Kilanga's novel, where the intellectual Mwanda discovers that the lady who kidnapped him, his niece, and then so the issue of family becomes important, that somebody you see as your enemy becomes, when you look into the face and you begin to trace the memory, you discover that there's a congenial relationship between you and the person. But it is not just family from the very superficial and biological sense. It's more in terms of ethically belonging to the same nation. And I would say something, am I, okay, when I see you, I thought that perhaps, okay. So there's a questioning, an interrogation of the whole concept of belonging to the human family in a very determinist sense. I mean, we always say that we form the human family, but it's a very ambitious statement, that because being a human being is not the same as being human. You can be a human being. We are all born humans, and yeah. But when we talk of the human family, it's an ambitious expression, because what has happened to humanity shows that we are not, a priori part of the same family. Racism and all the like. So there's a questioning of that very determinist sense of human family through these works. Human being is determinist. You don't choose to be a human. I mean, you could have well been born a goat or something. So, but being human is a constant ethical effort that we must all deploy, and which can be thrown into doubt at various moments of our personal history or our national history. So this is what these post-war novels try to interrogate, that human being is not a category that is fixed, because the history has proven to us that it's not the case. So it's about being human, and this is a constant effort that we must all deploy, and it's never finished. It's inconclusive. And there are moments where you yourself, you question that, did I behave really properly in this situation of violence? I mean, so we begin to question our own belonging to the human family. And so we keep the effort alive of trying to be human and not just being a human being. And one of the conclusions also that I draw from the post-war novels that runs across Congo and, and Peru is the fact that war memories are not only meant to solicit war novels, or all kinds of post-war writers are not only meant to solicit empathy or sympathy from the readers, but because, as Susan Sontag says in her text regarding the pain of others, compassion can weigh out very easily. I mean, when we get used to the deaths of Palestine, Congo, sometimes with all these media images, the human sense of compassion can easily weigh out, and you become tired of all these images, and it becomes somewhat natural. Okay. And so the focus in post-war novels has moved from simply drawing sympathy from the readers to some sort of try to see in what way are we connected or disconnected from the histories of violence. And this is where I quote a passage in Susan Sontag's very interesting regarding the pain of others, where she says that we have to set aside the sympathy we extend to others who are beset by war and murderous politics for a reflection on how our privileges are located on the same map as their suffering, and may, in ways we might prefer not to imagine, be linked to their suffering. As the wealth of some may imply the destitution of others, is a task for which the painful steering images supply only an initial spark. I mean, she writes about photography, war photography. And she's saying that, I mean, when we look at Congo, all that has happened in Congo, you know, it sometimes prima facie doesn't concern anybody. I mean, we are far from Congo, but you have to read post-war novels in terms of how are you connected or disconnected to these histories. I mean, we all know that Congo, most of the minerals produced in Congo, for example, actually coltan and cobalt are used in our smartphones that we have now. And so it might look far, but our prosperity, our, you know, smarting, you know, Facebook and all the like, somewhat there's a responsibility which we have to denounce the very conditions under which those minerals are produced, which we use in the neoliberal world without even thinking there's any linkage to these histories of violence. And so this is the kind of engaging literature that we have, you know, when it comes to post-war novels. It's not just committed literature, but committing literature, really bringing you face to face with the histories of violence and interpolating your own humanity, you know, in those texts that come out of situations of dire violence. And I think that's where I'm going to end. And certainly we will go, you know, along again with questions and perhaps elaborate much more than what I've said. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, Gilbert. The floor is open for questions, comments. Gracias, muchas gracias por la charla. Hay preguntas, comentarios.
Buenos días. Good morning. Thank you for this beautiful lesson. And my question is not directed to what we said, but it's connected to, I don't know how to say it. At this stage in our countries, in our societies, we have to talk about memories through history, historiography, through lots of things. And I mean, because at this stage, some of secret departments of information are being opened. Some of these departments are being desacralized, you know, and think that we have to go through our memories, okay? Through literature, now we're talking about literature and cinema. What position can we give when we think about our memories, about our human dimension, where you say, and the collective dimension as well? That's my question. Thank you.
Ashley?
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. My question is, you mentioned victims of peace, and you got into it a little bit about being present in small forms of violence. But I wanted to hear a little bit more about specifically what you meant about that. And then my second question is, so this notion of sort of healing and moving forward by recognizing the trauma that's been experienced among victims, but also having victims and sort of perpetrators of violence come face to face to better understand each other. But then how do you, like on a more community level, get folks to sort of move forward and to move forward towards forgiveness while also being very respectful and providing a space to reflect on trauma? And when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about sort of the peace vote that happened last year and how it was a very small, it was not a landslide, right? It was very divided country here in Colombia, where I think people that voted no were probably fueled by a lot of pain and trauma, but at the same time, there was the other half that just wanted peace, right? It's been long enough. like they just wanted to move forward and have peace. So this notion of how do you, it's difficult, it's complex, right? Because, you know, on one hand, it's obvious why someone would not want to forgive because of trauma and pain they've perceived. But on the other hand, it's sort of like how, you know, you can only live in this space of pain and hate for so long before it starts to like fester. So I don't know, it's a loaded question, but I'm just curious about your thoughts and also maybe if these themes emerged in the book.
Gracias. Gracias.
Thank you, Gilbert, for your interesting talk. I just have one question that I find difficult to reconcile in your presentation. You started by your presentation by pointing out how much prominent authors have been talking, how difficult it is to narrate violence, how much the level of violence have reached levels. I mean, I've reached points that it cannot be narrated, cannot be described. Kind of humanity has lost its face of human, as you point out. But then towards the end, you kind of point out how much claim is there about who can narrate it. In the case of Peru, between the middle class, educated middle class, as this author Alonso, and the victims of the atrocities in the Andes. And in the Congo, the same situation. If this author was a professor who had experience and so on and so forth. So where do we stand here? Can this violence be narrated? And if it can be, by whom? Who has the voice, in your point of view? Who can do that? Because if it cannot be narrated, but then there are people claiming that I'm the author, I'm the one who has the right to narrate it, and then where do we start? Thank you.
Many thanks. Questions? Is it okay if you take more questions? Can you note down, or would you prefer to answer? Okay. Okay, we'll do it. You answer three, and then we'll take a second round.
Yeah. I think I should begin with the last question by Rogers. It's quite interesting. I mean, how authors talk about the impossibility of narration, and they say so also from a particular space. For example, in the case of Adorno, he was talking in relation to the Holocaust. But of course, there's a critique also of that, because that is a very key drama in history, but other people also recognize other dramas in history. Slavery came before, and but the question of being difficult to narrate is the fact that some sort of, the violence actually presents you with a completely different face of man, of humanity. And the thing is that it doesn't keep you on a safe ground. You are also part of that history. And so even the medium of narration has to adopt a very difficult aesthetics of virulent self-reflexivity, because you are part of that history, not necessarily as a victim, but when you take into cognizance the statement by Sontag, you begin to be also critical about your own self, what you could have done, which you did not do, your responsibility, in that very complex paradigm. And so that's why post-war aesthetics have really some sort of developed a new language, a new language of writing, distorted sentences, completely new ways of naming the self. I usually work on one Congolese author called Sonny Labotangsi, who refers to the human flesh as meat. He is from Congo Brazzaville. He refers to the human flesh as meat. So he has to develop a different vocabulary, which in his case is very atavistic, really, because he doesn't see any difference between the human and the animalistic. So all through his novels, he refers to the human flesh as human meat. And that is for him very natural in all his novels. So it is difficult to develop that language because the violence uses up, the resources of language, and you have to write against language itself. So post-war representations become a critique of representation in that sense. That's a very strongly, aesthetic current in literature, which is also postmodern in some way. Really criticizing the claimed ability of language to express and to represent properly. That is what I would say as far as your question is concerned. In terms of whether who can narrate, it's a very interesting question. Why? Because who can narrate has been a very key question in Peru. Who can narrate what happened in Ayacucho from his Miraflores, Barrio Miraflores in Lima? So some of the literatures produced by the upper middle class intellectuals, of which Alonso Cueto can be said to be part of that, has been some sort of tourism literature. I mean, great tourism. People just say, okay, there was war in Ayacucho. Let me go there, do some investigation, and then write a novel. And so some of such novels have ended up being very superficial and repeating the binary of self and other, which the Peruvian state under Fujimori used to completely demonize the youth, mestizo youth who were most of them were part of Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path. So anybody writing from that, it doesn't mean that all those who write from that outer space don't write good novels about the war, but there need to be this kind of self-reflexive, aesthetics, which Alonso Cueto actually adopts in his text, by really trying to look at the war not from what the state under Fujimori, who actually used the war as a kind of instrument to also implant a very dictatorial state in Peru in the 90s, but some sort of de-link, and also get to see how the people from Ayacucho looked at their sons and daughters who were part of the Sendero Luminoso, because they actually had justifiable, we are all perhaps pacifists and we don't like war, but the situation was really tough. And so those who write from Ayacucho, some of whom were actually youths in that epoch, actually have usually sometimes a more naturalistic way of grasping the situation in Ayacucho that led to war. I can narrate the whole history of it, but I think it's of what really made Ayacucho to become the center. A lot of factors, historical, deeply historical, and some also conjunctural. So this is what makes people from authors from that part lay some claim about being able to understand the dynamics that led to the war in the first place. The question about literature and memory, it's quite interesting. Actually, I have a chapter on that, really, like in my work, and literature and memory. The difference, you also mentioned history, for example, and the advantage which literature has with regards to memory, it's the fact that it presents through the body, through the human body. History is usually very collective, and sometimes can fall prey to nationalistic ideologies. But memory is linked to the body, and that's what literature in such places get to do. There has been a very wide degree of literature of homecoming in these spaces of violence, both in Kivu, in Congo, and in Ayacucho. I handle some texts that have to do with the sense of homecoming, of those who had left these spaces of violence and they're coming back. And so the connection between literature and memory is much stronger, because it presents you with bodies that actually went through certain catastrophes and spaces. And as Pierre Nora says in his analysis of Lieux de Mémoire, places of memory, he says, while history hangs on events, memory hangs on places specific. As Professor Rutfors was talking about, the proximity between the space and the body. That is exactly what literatures of return in Peru and Congo have done. Somebody from that community coming and then getting to read the national history, to read the regional history to which he or she belongs through the space, and his recognition in that space. I've analyzed one of the novels by Charles Jungo Simba, Clouds on Bukavu, Notebook of a Return to the Homeland, where he left Eastern Congo and settled in Belgium, and he's coming back. And the way he looks at Kivu, the Kivu of his birth, Bukavu actually is the capital of North Kivu. So he really looks at the space of Kivu in terms of not just the physical space, but the lives that are buried underground. You know, the memories of people that are lost, and it's a very dire situation which he analyzes in that, which he represents in that text, because given the very capitalistic mentality, both by the locals and the multinationals in the mines of Eastern Congo, some of the graves actually of the victims are now minefields without any proper rites or rituals of burial. And this is how literature captures, you know, literature becomes a kind of what Walter Benjamin calls an excavation. You like dig with a spade, you know, memories that are buried under the ground. And this is exactly what literature does, literatures of return in post-war situations. The question about, the exact, okay, imaging victims of peace, right? Yes. The very deplorable case is that of the Congo. As I say, there was an attempt in Peru, something along the lines of what happened in South Africa, where, you know, there was a cathartic moment where the victim could, you know, in a forum express what he or she went through, and sometimes in the presence of the perpetrator. Less in Peru, but in South Africa, it was, you know, the system succeeded in getting a lot of perpetrators face to face with their victims. In Peru, not very much the case, because somehow there's a kind of military ethic that means that most of the crimes committed by the military in Peru are still very much shielded. And this is exactly what he talks about, what Alonso Cueto talks about in this novel, because the crime committed by his father didn't feature in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example. But there was at least an attempt by the post-Fujimori regime under the presidency of Francesco Toledo. There was an attempt in Peru to really come to terms with this violence through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In the Congo, what happens is that, some of the leaders who committed the crimes, Jean-Pierre Bemba of the MLC is now in the International Court of Justice. Bosco Taganda is also there. Laurent Kunda is somewhere in Rwanda. We don't know, because he was sponsored at some level by Paul Kagame. We don't know whether he's behind the bars or Kagame is playing the game. But there are political alliances being made by local politicians with the present government of Joseph Kabila. Some sort of, let us forget about the war. We are now in a new Congo transitory, you know. But there's been no, you know, the plight of the women who are suffering from both physical and psychological damage in the Congo has really not been addressed. Some NGOs are struggling. Some doctors have gotten international prizes through what they have done, you know, even at the very personal Médecins Sans Frontières. But the state has not taken charge, you know, of its responsibility in making sure that those victims of violence are catered for. Either through treatment, you know, like psychiatric treatment in line with post-traumatic distortions, or with more even cultural approaches, or even financial compensation or nothing. It is still, and this is what comes very often in the literature of the Congo. These memories that are still there, the state has not addressed them. Yes, you talked about the second part of your question was, yes, the second part of your question, I think you had to, it was, yeah.
So basically, I was trying to I was trying to think about if any of this was addressed in your book around like forgiveness on the side of the victim, right? So
yes,
not getting over, but like pushing through the victimization, the trauma that's been experienced to move forward. And I use the example of the yes no vote. I mean, I know that there are a lot of reasons why people vote no that have nothing to do with the fact that, like, you know, they don't want to forgive. There's probably a lot of financial gain, a lot of other sort of greed-fueled reasons. But I'm just wondering how you push past that. And we see that, right, in crime and violence and things like that as well, of like not wanting to forgive criminals. But I was just wondering if that was addressed. Like, how do you,
Yes,
from a community perspective?
Yes, and now I fully get the second dimension of your question. Yes, you're absolutely right. It is never a conclusive process per se. And even in the case of South Africa, that is hailed as paradigmatic, it is, when you ask those who bet those confessions, whether they actually forgave the perpetrators, sometimes it's negative. But there was an attempt to really come to this face-to-face encounter and to say that we can forgive within the state, the apparatus put by the state, in the case of South Africa, Desmond Tutu, for example, but you cannot forget easily. You cannot forget, but it's about coming to a stage where you can at least accept that even the other, no matter the violence committed, is still a human being, and that you deserve to some sort of work out a formula of cohabitation within a polity under the state, nation state. But it's always a process that is full of contradictions, and you can never say it's conclusive, really. And this is what I said in the conclusion, that it's always work in progress. But there have been new approaches that are less approaches to handling post-war situations of violence victims that are less based on post-traumatic dysfunctions and more apply a more Bakhtinian approach to post-war situations of violence, in terms of that the fact that Bakhtin says that no event is conclusive, or there hasn't been any defining events yet in the history of mankind, that there's always a dialogic kind of relationship with events in history. So some events happen that might sound very defining, that's the kind of apocalyptic end, but there's still a kind of a human possibility of regeneration. And so this is how we try to approach post-war situations. Yes, the war occurred, it was really damaging, but we think we can still find a formula of reimagining the Peruvian nation, the Congolese nation, because violence itself, or this mentality of vengeance, can also be counterproductive also in the long term for the victim, him or herself, for example. So yes, the Bakhtinian approach has really been quite domineering in handling post-war situations, about the dialogic nature of every human event, no matter how catastrophic it is. There's always a space for something else to occur, which could some sort of be more positive and permit the human nature to regenerate itself. And that's what literature is very strong at that imagining hope even in the face of hopelessness, as as a very famous philosopher said.
Okay, many thanks. There are a few more questions.
Mark Bloch is the name of the
Maravos
philosopher.
first, then Eberhard.
Thank you for that really stimulating talk. I have a question about your idea of the colonial geography of sympathy in these, and how that appears in these novels. You noted that a key theme in the novels is that it's through the understanding of the protagonist's understanding of the experiences and the trauma of the victims, that they can develop a sympathy and then a possibility to know themselves, and then also then to know the nation, and there's some incipient or possible idea of reconciliation there, and then realizing their humanity through understanding the nation in this way. But then I was wondering, how do these authors think about the relationship between the national family and the human family, which you also spoke about? And I was thinking about the citation you made of Sontag at the end, this idea that the worth of some is tied to the denigration of others. And of course, the colonial geography of sympathy is partly and dramatically a story of internal colonialism in these contexts, but it's also very importantly a global story of colonial exploitation. And so I'm curious how these authors treat the relationship between those two.
Okay, so I will follow with the Next question.
Thanks so much for your talk. Oh, sorry. No, it's okay.
Okay, so quickly, as we're already in the second panel, which deals with interdisciplinarity and perspectives of that, I would be interested, the focus you had, for instance, on Levinas, the kind of the other, the Antlitz, I don't know what is in English, the Antlitz. So this kind of intersubjectivity between me and the other. So this is something which I work as social geographer as well in this theoretical perspective on recognition. So my question would be, how could you think that what you're doing with interpreting novels in a historical or recent context on violence, on post-conflict, how would you see perhaps a kind of interdisciplinary collaboration with a sociologist or a geographer to bring something really together? So to have something to would you have ideas how to do interdisciplinary work together? That's the one question. And the other one is, how do you deal with the issue of northern and southern epistemologies? For instance, you mentioned just philosophers from Germany, at least, Levinas, as well, Adorno. Okay. So just how is there, do you deal with this issue of southern northern epistemologies in your work that you try to address self-reflexive as well, your own fields of getting inspirations and dealing with issues of the global south? The issues of the global south, what you deal with is post-conflict, and just mention even northern scholars, not just as a critique, just how to deal with it.
Thanks so much for your talk. I think many of the things you said can be applied to Colombia also, and it's very interesting to make the kind of reflections you did. I was wondering if you could say something about Cueto and Colchado, and I don't know if you have seen the film La Teta Asustada, because one of the problems that I see in Peru is that you have traveled also to cultural dimension, because the Andean people who were hit by the conflict, or the ethnic group, the Ashaninka in the rainforest, they don't think West. They have their own cosmologies, their own world of view. So it's not only, it's also a cartography of a very strong cultural difference. And I think Colchado and maybe the film I mentioned try to offer an Andean cultural perspective. I would like also if you can explain a little bit about the ethnic dimension of the conflict in Congo. And my third question would be, what do we do with oral tradition? Because I think many of the histories of the conflicts will circulate in Peru, in Colombia, in Congo through oral tradition, but not in written lit. And so if we want to hear many voices, how do we consider oral tradition?
Thank you, Gilbert, for this excellent and stimulating presentation. I have a few questions. I'm just trying to formulate them properly. The first question is the concept of reconciliation. It sounded very vague to me because, I mean, you mentioned Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So you mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but in the case of South Africa, I mean, you know, people are saying, okay, we sort of destroyed this monster, but we're still struggling. Our stomachs are still in war. So you didn't mention anything about economic distribution, which is a very key aspect in post-conflict countries. And I find it very interesting that you move from gender, reconciliation, forgiveness, but it will be good to mention the economic aspect, which plays a significant role because
In some cases, you have people who are sort of politically reconciled, but economically they're still facing a massive war and massive inequalities. And that is the heart of the conflict. And that should also be addressed. But the liberal understanding of peace is just, okay, stop the conflict and we implement some neoliberal policies, and few elites enrich themselves and the rest of people remain the same.
Okay, many thanks. I think for sake of kind of timing, I think you should choose in a way, I think, because if I counted, there are at least 8 questions in.
Yes.
So just like try to kind of be somehow brief. I mean, I'm sorry, or we can continue, but I kind of, I'm just considering.
How many minutes left? How many minutes for mine?
Well, we are well over time, but you can just go ahead and answer the question, but try to kind of be.
Okay. In that case, I will start in reverse order so that it stays fresh in our mind. The question of Asaf about the other side of reconciliation, the economic, discrepancies. Yeah, it's quite clear that even the terminology of novel of reconciliation is actually problematic in Peru. As I say again, still along these lines of people in the areas that we touched by this violence feel that those who write from the upper middle class of Lima are very fast in talking about reconciliation, whereas in the Peruvian in national ethos they haven't really been that kind of radical reimagination of what Peru is. That is not just the Creole class, the oligarchs in Lima, but also the Andean majority, for that matter, a minoritariized majority, and then the Amazonian and the Ashaninkas and all these people. So of course, it's the reason why I was critical about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that even most of the recommendations, a great work was done by the members of that commission, many of whom were recognized intellectuals in Peru, anthropologists, literary scholars. One of them, Carlos Ivan de Gregori, as really, even as part of the members, as part of that commission, said what we recommended has not really, been taken off. Even reparations, economic policies that needed to some sort of, be implemented in the Andean part of Peru, they haven't been implemented. Peru itself has gotten into a lot of political wranglings, and Toledo, who was really seen to be the post-Fujimori savior, who actually claimed to also have some Andean roots, was put out of power, and now he's involved in other branches. So a lot of things have happened in Peru, which completely has some sort of even displaced attention from the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and what had to be done to placate these deeply, these deep historical wounds, economically, culturally too. And yes, the question about the cartography of the cultural perspectives also emerging from this history of war. And you cited the person who has really brought that perspective in view, Oscar Cochado, through his novel. Actually, it's part of my corpus because I thought I really had to get into how the Andean cosmology works, and also how the war itself was perceived, through the second return of the Pachacuta, and also there was a completely different way of imagining what was happening in Peru, and also that the language actually of the commission did not reflect very much the cultural mindset actually of those who really suffered the war. Most of whom are Quechua speaking and really part of this culture. So novels like that of Oscar Cochado really help us understand the very cultural mindset and imagination of that war from a very different perspective from the way somebody like Alonso Cueto would write. So these are the various cultural insights that novels from the heartland of where the war happened bring in terms of intercultural dialogue in post-war situation. The ethnic dimension of the war in the Congo is quite complex, as anybody who knows that part would tell you. It's a mosaic of all kinds of alliance. But looking at these countries from different continents, it's difficult to do this kind of transcontinental research, really. So because the causes of the war in Congo are quite different from the cause of the war in Peru, but I was interested in the dynamics of the violence itself, that despite the different causes, economical and historical, the way the war functioned and the kind of marks that it has left can be studied comparatively. And with regards to the ethnic dimension of the war per se, it was, for me, I focused on the Mai Mai, the Mai Mai militia, which somebody would say it's a vigilante, and which I compared with the ronderos, rondos campesinos in Peru, in precisely in the region around Huanta and Ayacucho, because the very ethnic dimension has been brought to bear actually by the Mai Mai alliances, which were first of all sponsored by Mobutu, to fight the invading army of Kabila, backed by Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda, to fight. So he armed, these ethnic militias to fight against the invading army of Laurent Kabila. But when the war was over, the alliance, the kind of dynamics within the Mai Mai became so violent that the same groups of Mai Mai from different ethnic groups who fought against the invaders actually started fighting again among themselves. So it became very ethnic through this very fluid change of alliances in the eastern part of the Congo, also including the Banyamulenge. The Banyamulenge rebels actually, who have some sort of ethnic affinity with Rwanda, and they are always those that the Rwandan government would use when it wants to, to do something in the eastern part of the Congo. So that's a very, so when Kabila came to power, the Banyamulenge, who had brought him to power, because Kabila was supported by Kagame, but later on they had, their own difficulties. So it became an issue of those from the eastern, cross-border Banyamulenge, with some of who actually speak, the Tutsi language, became a threat to the very Kabila whom they helped to bring to power. So there was a lot of ordering in that sense. And even presently, the ethnic dimension again comes up when you go to Kinshasa today, you will discover that in the government circles, because it is Laurent Kabila, who comes from, the Swahili-speaking part of the country, the government, language of administration becomes even Swahili. So that speaking Swahili now gives you some sort of capital, symbolic capital. And so it tells you how power and ethnicity actually, work in the Congo. It's like it's our time to eat. It happens in Cameroon that sometimes you go to the office and you are welcomed in a wondo, like the language of the president who is in power. And so a lot of things, go into that kind of ethnic dimension. The other answer, I think you also had a third dimension. Okay, I'm not supposed to perhaps answer. Now, going to the colonial geography of sympathy. It's something that is even not just historical or you read in novels, but let me just give you a very simple example. I think I discussed that with somebody. When terrorists attack, I don't know, London or Paris or New York or Berlin, we suddenly all become Je suis Paris, je suis, I don't know what else. But when terrorists attack Maiduguri in Nigeria, Boko Haram, or attack the Sinai, for example, we are not Je suis Sinai, Je suis, it doesn't sound even sexy for a lot of people. So it means that there's a kind of colonial geography of sympathy that, as Foucault says, we even the very those who are the margins actually even reproduce it unconsciously, and that is really how the global geography of sympathy actually works. I could go to the novels, but since our time, yes, then the question of Professor Rothfuss in terms of the epistemology first. Of course, in decolonial criticism, there's a lot of transcultural dialogue. to acknowledge the fact that even within the ambit of Western epistemology, there have been critics from within. And so these critics are useful useful to decolonial critics, transmodern critics like Enrique Dussel. Actually, the authority in the Theologia de Liberación builds his thoughts very much on that of Levinas. Of course, the Jewish tradition also is a contributor to the European, epistemology, but also other. It's also other. So the thought of Emmanuel Levinas becomes important in as much as it produces a critique of that ontological and Cartesian imagination of subjectivity, which has, in very broadly historical dimensions, led to the colonial self, the conquering self. And so Walter Benjamin, for example, is quite interesting because even within that tradition of German philosophy, he was a critic. He actually provided insight in a critic to the mainstream. And so it is quite interesting that we can have this kind of transcontinental alignment in terms of theoretical underpinnings. So I find a lot of connections with Fanon. The Caribbeans have always been, like, geographically and also epistemologically, been a kind of, bridge in so many ways. So post-colonial authors use Fanon, and decolonial authors from Latin America use Fanon. So there's a point of encounter in this theoretical, which does not leave Europe, because within Europe also, as I've said, they were critical also of the mainstream colonizing philosophy, which we blame for the colonization and all. Yeah. Any other? Have I left something? Yeah.
I think if there is something left, I hope we can continue, or we can talk after the session. And I'm very sorry. I wish, because this is such a stimulating and fascinating discussion and topic and presentation, but I just think for the sake of timekeeping and organization and giving the space to the others as well, we need to move on now. Entonces, muchas gracias por toda la presentación y preguntas. Many thanks. Y espero, yo estaba diciendo en inglés, espero que podamos continuar con este tipo de discusión y preguntas, pues siguiendo, digamos, en algún sentido con la discusión. Bueno, la próxima presentación que vamos a tener es de Aminata Mbaye. Ella va a hablar sobre Performing Gender Identities in Fatou Diam Novels Ketala. Aminata está trabajando como investigadora postdoctoral en la Universidad de Beirut. So let me introduce you, say just briefly in English as well, Aminata Mbaye, who is going to talk about performing gender identities in Fatou Diam's novel Ketala. Aminata is by training anthropologist. I like to say as an anthropologist myself, but now working more in kind of interdisciplinary and literary studies themes, and her topic will be about gender identities in this particular novel. Aminata is based in Universidad in Bayreuth as a postdoctoral research fellow, I believe. So Aminata, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, first of all, for the organization of this conference, and to Jan and Rosa. So my presentation is a part of my PhD that I defending 1 year ago, and which was about an analysis, discourse analysis on homosexuality in Senegal. So today I represent the literary part, but I was also in the field, and I met activists, and also I work with religious association. So this is just one part, and maybe we can, during the discussion, speak about the other aspect. So I will present or focus on one particular novel that I analyze, which is Ketala of Fatou Diom, who is a Senegalese woman writer. And I would like to begin by speaking a bit about the first novel of Francophone African woman writer. So the first novel from a Francophone African woman writer appeared in the 1970s and 80s. And they have initiated a new kind of reflection about women's condition inside African societies. And for example, novelists as Aminata Soufal or Mariam Abba from Senegal, Very King, or Kalis Beala from Cameroon initiated a new wave concerning literature, which was pretty much before written by men. So they have embraced through their narrative a vast array of topics concerning the question of polygamy, but also by depicting marginalized woman identities, such as a condition of sex worker in the continent. And for example, I analyze in my thesis also a novel of Aminata Soufal at the end of the 1970s, and in her novel she critique the development of the Senegalese society and also the increasing of the poverty in the country, and also neoliberalism, or the development of neoliberalism in Senegal. So differently from this first wave of African women writers, a new generation describe writing differently, and Fatou Diom, the author of this presentation focus on, underlies, for example, the necessity to dissociate literature from politics, and also consider that writing is mostly a personal quest. And she perceives artistic creation as a possibility to remain outside of any kind of categorization, that is to say, as a Black person, but also as a woman. Nevertheless, if we look at her literary work, we have a vivid and strong reflection on the contemporary social issues and point of reflection. So a first short stories collection, La Préférence Nationale, that she published in 2001, tackle, for example, the problem for young migrants in France, in which they face social problems such as unemployment, racism, and ostracism. And with the first novel, Le Ventre de l'Atlantique, that she published in 2003, she drew inspiration from her own history, and she depicts again the life of young immigrants in France. And the thematic of migration is present in almost all of her work. Also just a minute. In Ketala, that I analyzed in this presentation and that she published in 2006, she also deals again with this issue of migration, but also explore and interrogate current gender dynamic in Senegal by showing the difficulties of certain gender identities, such as gay people in the country. And really interesting and important because it was published 2 years before that 8 people were put in jail because of their supposed homosexuality. and start to this point, there were a big campaign against homosexuality in the country. So what is interesting is that the novel was written before this event. So I will focus on my presentation of today on the novel of Ketala, as I said, and I will particularly try to address two questions. So firstly, how the depiction of homosexuality in the novel echoes the denunciation of the violence and exclusion faced by certain identities inside the Senegalese society. And secondly, how this condemnation is also closely tied up with a singular poetic and aesthetic setting working on reconfiguring the authentic realm. So I would like to speak more about this notion and theory before starting to describe the novel. So I rely for this presentation particularly on the notion of performances and performativity, and on Judith Butler conception, who relies on Austin theory to analyze the performative process through which gender is normally constructed. So Butler defined performativity as, I quote, the reiterative and citational practice by which discourse produces the effect that it names. And she also said that gender as well as body are shaped by dynamic of power. So that is to say that subject assumes a sex through a process of identification. And with this notion of identification, she refers more perceivably on the Foucauldian theory and also on Althusser's theory. So she said that the construction of the subject, relying on this idea of identification, so begin with an initial submission to power, I quote, subjection is a subordination that the subject brings on itself. So that means that subject acquires its identity within the heterosexual imperative by adopting a specific genre. So like this, heterosexuality can be seen as a kind of performative, and she explains that the enactment of gender roles operate also by the embodiment of certain ideas of femininity and masculinity defined within the heterosexual matrix, and that the subject interiorizes and performs. So considering that gender construction is deeply embedded with normative procedures of categorization, we can then ask the following question: how subjects who do not recognize themselves within the normative categorization established by their community can find their place? And the second question, if subjectivity is crystallized through subjection and normalization, how abject or queer subjects can re-elaborate and redefine their own identity? So to reply to this question, Butler, referring to the reappropriation of the derogative term queer by the LGBT community, considers that gender categorization can be thwarted. So she said that language can go through process of renaming and acquire other signification. So the theory of Butler had been criticized and also revisited by a lot of scholars. And for this presentation, I draw more particularly on the theory of José Esteban Muñoz, who draw on the concept of intersectionality for advocating for a more plural or rather intersectional conception of identity. So also in Africa, several scholars are advocating for the homogenization of queer theory. And they argue that studies which are conducting in Africa shows that historical colonial framework and recent criminalization of queer people make more difficult public queer performance observation. So I said that I mentioned that in 2008, 28 people were put in jail, and maybe I should speak more about the context. So homosexuality in Senegal is condemned by the law, and the people who are found guilty of same-sex sexual practices can be put in jail up to 5 years, and also have to pay a certain amount of money. So this situation explains why in the public sphere you have few direct revendication, for example, like in Western society for gay marriage or adoption or whatsoever. So the situation is different due to this criminalization of homosexuality. So Munoz, to come back to him, analyzed queer of color performances as a process of disidentification which take place in different localities. So by taking this idea of disidentification, it allows us to extend the notion of performance to local minoritarian counter-narrative, which as such are not always visible. Now I would like to speak more about the relation with its notion with the novel Ketala, and so I will. So Ketala features a queer life story by depicting the path of three figures: Maku, Tamsir, Tamara, and Memora. So through the description of Tamsir Tamara's life history, Fatou Diom's novel highlights simultaneously the difficult fate of queer people in Senegal who are constantly enduring social rejection, and also the violence of patriarchal power. So Tamsir Tamara, for example, is a good example in the novel. So he's a young Gambian, and he's committed for treatment in a psychiatric hospital after that his father, who is a soldier, discovered his gay identity. So Tamsir's father considers this imprisonment as a kind of re-education, and however, when the doctor confessed their incapacity to bring out the devil supposed to be inside him, he decided to enlist his son in the army. So in the army, he's perceived as a gay man, and he has to undergo corrective rapes. So I quote the novel. So the novel is written in French, and they are not. It's not translated into English, so I make the translation myself. Indeed, often when the dormitory was plunged into darkness, when one could only hear sleepers' regular breaths, the door magically opened. Discreet steps passed all over the bed and stopped in front of his own. Virile hands were locking him, another was gauging him, while a bulky man was taking care of his bum. His three assailants only left after he has been possessed by each of them. So after this this journey in the army, he escaped and he encountered Maku. So Maku is a young Senegalese, and both of them ran away from Gambia to Senegal. So this getaway with Maku represents the transformation of Tamsir in the novel. I quote, "In order to better their chances of crossing the city without arousing suspicion, they pretending to be a couple with a child. Tamsir as often was dressed as a woman." So that start to this point, Tamsir becomes Tamara. So this is really interesting because in Wolof, in Senegal, you have these figures of the Goljigen. who is a traditional figure within the Senegalese society. So Goljigen means man, woman. And this man, woman were like traditionally accepted by the society. So they were dressing as a woman and performing in ceremonies like baptism, circumcision, and so on. So a lot of scholars who have worked on homosexuality in Senegal has argued that these figures of the Goljigen was similar to the one of the homosexual in Western society. Nevertheless, this is also a bit problematical to make this relation because, as other scholars pointed out, the term homosexual is or the identity gay or homosexual is related with a political and historical context and situation, which was not the same that we had in Senegal in the past. So, but we can speak also about it during the conversation. So to come back to the novel, the transformation, what is interesting is that the transformation of Tamsir to Tamara is give him the possibility to be accepted within the society. So we can say that Tamsir Tamara's subversion operates through a kind of a queer performance. And as Butler argues, the drag or the transvestite performance is not only embodied through the fact to wear all the clothes or adopting different manner that his own gender require, but rather should be read as a kind of theoretical agency. In which the difference between gender is hyperbolically deconstructed. So Ketala parodies gender construction within society by showing how Tamara finally comes to represent the feminine perfection to everyone. So when she moved to Senegal, she opened a dance school, and she's like for everyone the perfection of a woman and Senegalese woman in the society. Contrary to Tamsir Tamara, Makou and Memoria's history show how subject is shaped through multiple and sometimes contradictory sites of identification. So after his escape with Tamara, Makou decided to live a kind of a double life, and he conformed to the expectation of his family and get married to Memoria. So, but after then, Memoria discovers the truth and his homosexuality, both of them run away to France to escape from the pressure of their family, and also try to change the sexual orientation of Makou. But paradoxically, like this escape leads them to the reproduction to what they try to contest in their own society. And in France, they experience against marginality because they are confronted with racism, violence, and so on. So this the description of the past of these three protagonists show us that a kind of perpetual errantry. So we have a continuous escape from a place to another, which exemplifies the difficulty for queer bodies to inhabit the world. And from the beginning in the novel, neither Memoria nor Makou and Tamsir had a place on their own. So to conclude concerning this, the history of the three characters exemplifies the hybrid process through which identity are constructed. But also, just a moment, yeah. But however, Jom's novel interrogate identity formation as well as identity transformation, not only by showing the path of these different characters within the novel, but also by the blurring of traditional literary genre and structure. So in this regard, the narrative construction combines different registers as well as the use of polyphony to reflect voices, discordances within the society. So I would like to speak a bit more about this question of genre and in literature. So Zvetan Todorov said that a literary gender doesn't exist prior to the work, but rather emanates from the text during the writing process. And also Rancière, who is a French philosopher, points out that the modernity in art shouldn't be conceived in terms of an opposition between modernity and tradition, but rather modernity engages reinterpreted decision, leading to the co-presence of heterogeneous temporality. So this notion of transgression, which we found in Rancière's theory and also in Todorov, nourish also Bakhtin's perspective on novel, which is in his theory pluralistic, plurilingual, and plurivocal. In Bakhtin's conception, novel operate through a dialogic process, what Gilbert mentioned earlier, and this notion of dialogism gives a possibility to think about the relation between literature and society. So if we go back to Jom's novel, so the novel of Fatou Diom elaborates what could be defined as a kind of a queer poetic or queer aesthetic. So Ketala deconstructs gender categorization, firstly by blurring boundaries between imaginary and reality. So we have the intertwining of different spaces and temporality within the novel. And also Ketala feature heterotopic places by placing side by side places that are normally incompatible. So the novel begins with the description of an empty room, and only after this inaugural scene, we got to know that this apartment where silence has been suddenly materialized belongs to Memoria, who died since 3 years before. So the retelling of the story of Memoria, Maku and Tamara operate to a kind of magical performance. So during a stormy night, the object inside this empty room at the beginning apartment start to speak and to animate themselves. So the story that we get is told by objects who become animate, so like a real person. So what is interesting that is like you have, for example, watch, and to exemplify this animation, watch is written with a capital letter, so it's become a person. So this is this idea of magical performance inside. So this means that the objects replace human to tell untold stories and are also in charge to reactivate memory. So Ketala understands memory in this sense as a faculty of remembering or recalling. And this is also a kind of perception or description that we have concerning the work of the historian. So I refer to Michel de Certeau, describes the writing of in history in this term, that is to say, as a process that would like to restore the forgotten and to meet again men of the past amidst the traces that they have left. So this is also something that we have like in the retelling of the history by also the historian. So as I said, the object recounts of Ketala character life story can be described as a kind of genealogic performance in the sense that they excavate the past for conceiving alternative to our present condition. So this reconstruction works through surrogation, in other words, a theoretical principle of substitution of one person for another. By evoking forgotten histories, the novel constructs an imaginary archive of the condition of queer people in Senegal. And this idea of genealogical performance is really interesting, because in the novel you have also this polyphony, because the story is not told by one object but by all the objects. So we have also the story of what is happening in this room, where the objects are like fighting against each other, and also fighting to tell the story of Memoria. And we have another story, which is the story of Memoria, Tamsir Tamara and Makou. So we have like the imbrication of different temporality and also and spatiality. So to conclude what I have been said, we can see that Fatou Diom's novel offers a singular representation of queer life condition in Senegal, and Ketala highlights this counter-narrative by using a singular aesthetic and poetic. So, however, the world which is depicted in the novel is different from the real world. So we can say through this that Diom displayed imaginary to reflect on how on reality. So this particular poetic or aesthetic setting obliges us to question the place of literature and more generally art in the production of knowledge. So this is what I did in my PhD when I analyzed the different novel, and also I have one movie. By interrogating the representation which is given by literature and cinema concerning homosexuality. And also, more generally, the relation between literature or art and the real world. So concerning this, I argue that in the PhD that art emanates from a paradox. So while it provides us a reflection on our world, our work also withdraw from the reality through imagination. So Ketala particularly deconstruct fixed gender categorization as well as spatial boundaries and reveals the imbrication and correlation between different world and history, what I have been said. And the novel cannot be tied in with one particular genre because you have this kind of fairy tale, but also it's also a novel. So you have really like this in between literary genre in Ketala. So it's not one particular genre, or it's also not one particular space or culture, but it's positioned itself in between, in a kind of intermediary position, neither completely inside nor completely outside. And this is some things which is also that we also found in the theory of Adorno, but also of in the theory of Patrice Galland, who is a Cameroonian author and also critic and philosopher. And in his essay concerning African literature, he said he asked himself how African literature can represent African societies. And he mentioned the fact, for example, against a kind of Sartrean and Brechtian theory of art, that if we want to reflect on the relation between literature and reality, and also the possibility for writers to change or influence African society, we have also to take into consideration different factors. So first of all, that if we take the example of literature which is produced in Africa, but this novel or literature are written in French, And that means that it's not the language of the population who are there. So you have, for example, in Senegal, analphabetism, and also people who don't go to school and who cannot read French. So the public of these books are not always the African public or the people in Africa. There is also the question of the literary field, so in reference to Bourdieu, and this is important concerning Francophone or literature who are edited and published by Western publishing house. So in the example of Fatou Diome, the publishing house are in French. So she is published, has also other authors by French publishing house, although they are like now the development of a publishing house in Africa too, or in Francophone Africa or in Senegal. And also he mentioned the fact that the African writers are, for some of them, disconnecting from the place that they describe in Africa, because for example, they live in Europe. If we take again the case of Fatou Diome, she migrates from Senegal to France, and yeah, she doesn't live with the population. So this is the different points that he mentioned to analyze this relation between the African writer and the societies in Africa. So if we take into consideration these different points, we can ask ourselves, how does reading literature help us to better understand the world, and in this context, queer trajectory in Senegal and elsewhere. So with the example of Ketala, we can reply to this question by saying that literary production can be read as a kind of metaphoric representation, and that literature finally enables us to reflect through imagination on the potential possibility to conceive another world. Thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks for this fascinating talk. The floor is open. Muchas gracias por la presentación. ¿Hay preguntas, comentarios?
Thank you. I think what I missed in the presentation was the role of religion, because I think in many cases religion, okay, because in many cases you do have, as you correctly mentioned, the idea of homosexuality being practiced, but then you have Christianity, you have Islam being sort of the critics or the guys who pushing the idea that it shouldn't happen. So I think it would be best also to mention that in some cases, I mean, I'm thinking of case of South Africa, where you have in some cases where it's okay to be practiced, but then you have these moral, so to say, people who from religion who sort of defend that, you know, they push a very strong moralistic idea about it. So the second aspect, I think you could still live somewhere else, but yet being able to analyze your own society. I think it's a bit problematic in my understanding, where you say, okay, you kind of essentialize, you know, only if you live with us, then you can sort of describe. And I also don't have a problem with writing in for a particular context, because this story needs to be heard. Yeah, that's all my contribution.
Thank you. Congratulations for your interesting working. I think it has a lot of interesting insights about contemporary African issues. I'm not really very well informed in about homosexuality and so on, but my question is how relevant or important and necessary is the use of concept of homosexuality to understand sexuality in Africa? Why am I asking this? Because the question is it this concept of homosexuality, is it helpful? Does it really helps to reconstruct, to describe African sexuality? I think that in many societies around the world, not just African societies, queer identities and same-sex practice may have been common at some point or throughout their history, and might not have been necessarily named homosexuality. You describe some case about that in Senegal. And I think that the moment that we use this politically problematic concept of homosexuality, we start a fight that probably is not in the interest of Africans. It might be the case that in Senegal or in Mozambique or an African country, queer identities, men performing as women or women performing as men, has been, I don't know, probably common practice. But the moment that these practices have been conceptualized as homosexuality, I think we start to fight that as its genealogy and origin in the Western, and they have their own issues there. Is it really necessary to reconstruct the African sexuality based on this concept? That's my question.
Thank you. And one more question. Here, Teresa.
Thank you for the lesson, for your presentation. But my question it's similar to the last one. You mentioned I can't pronounce the name properly. The person, the character who traditionally dresses, transfigurates his gender. It's a multi-gender person, I think. I'd like to understand what the representation of this character is, symbolically what that means. Is we have this the same in Mozambique when we have some kind of some pieces of literature or songs. We have people who can change voices, and even when they are performing, they even dress differently. How do we read? How can we read this comparing with this? It's the same question actually. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if you want to answer.
So concerning the role of religion, so I spoke about for this presentation on the novel. So in the novel, she doesn't tackle this question of religion, but in my PhD, of course, as I said, I also work on this question, and I write an article. Just wrote an article about this new politic of belongings, which appears in Africa through religion and in Senegal through religion, consideration with the idea of homosexuality, and like concerning the condemnation of homosexuality from a religious perspective in Senegal. I have to mention that this condemnation is pretty new, and is also come from new religious groups and Islamic groups, so from called reformist groups, and they are minoritarian in the society. So you have the main two brotherhoods, the Mourija and the Tijana, which are like where like most of the Senegalese are affiliated. And since the 80s, there were like this increasing of reformism or Islamic reformism in Senegal. And this is really interesting because actually the first one who condemned homosexuality in Senegal was the reformist association, Jamra, who published, so Jamra born has a kind of critiques against the way like African Senegalese the Senegalese Brotherhood were practicing Islam. So they advocate to a return to scriptural sources and also to follow the text and so on. So they launch a review, and in this review, they attacked the new, what was perceived by them as a new phenomenon of modernization, so prostitution, debauchery, and homosexuality. And what is really interesting is that JAMRA is also an association who is in the prevention of HIV/AIDS. So in their program of prevention, they are also helping or like supposed to deal with the question of same-sex sexuality. And in 2008, when the 9 homosexuals were put in jail, it was also JAMRA who were the first to condemn the practices and also advocate publicly against same-sex practices and so on. So I think that is the reason why, I mean, I analyze this new religious Senegalese group in a term of new politic of belonging, because I think that they emerge as a time of a crisis in Senegal, and they try to re-elaborate the links or the relation or the idea of also the Senegalese nation by also putting boundaries and delimiting who should be part of the society and who shouldn't be part of the society. So, so in this sense, of course, religion have played really a big role in the condemnation, and also, for example, in Uganda or like with New Pentecostalist church, for example, and so on. So I totally agree with you. So concerning your question, your second critics of the essentialization, it was not. I also agree with that. I didn't want to say that people who write who are like living in the diaspora, for example, or migrate are not. I mean, I don't have the right to write about Africa. I mean, it's in the so I draw on the text of Nganong, and what he was saying is that you have to take into consideration the fact that authors who are like writing novels or also describing African society, and maybe like in the case of Fatou Diom is really interesting because she said that she's not doing politics, but you have like in the past this idea of that literature should change the society. So this is what he speak about when he criticized like this Sartrean like conception. And what he said is that he said that if literature change, I mean, if we consider that this writer changes society, we should also consider the place or their positionality within the society, and the fact that they come, maybe they are not living in the place, they have also privileged position and so on. So this doesn't mean that they don't have the right, but I mean the positionality and where you come from, also where you publish, and is also really important to when it's come to speak about the implication of literature. So concerning this, the fact if homosexuality is relevant, or so I think that they are like different level. So if we look at the past, and I take the example of the gold again, I think that is also a view that is shared by Henriette Gunkel, who worked on South Africa. And she was saying that the identity, gender, like homosexual or gay or lesbian, are related with a Western political context, which is really specific. And this is the reason why to say that Golgigen are were equivalent to homosexual is really problematical, because the contexts were not the same. And actually, what we see with this, with the Golgigen, for example, who were dressing as a man, was a man who was dressing as a woman, and who had also a certain role within the society. The focus was not on the practices, but it was on his the cultural role that he had for the society, and his position was a bit the one of the griot. So the griot in the Senegalese society, but also in other society or African society or Western society, is the one who transmits the memory. So, for example, in the wedding, you will have the Golgigen who will come and who will help important women to organize the ceremony, but they will also be the one who will retell the story, for example. They will also, accompany when Senghor at the independence took the power. They were also Golgigen were accompanying him, because he was also surrounded by Drianke, this big woman who have an influence on the society. So we see that the focus was not so much on sexual practices, but this was in the past. But what happened nowadays is that the term Golgigen became stigmatized by the society. And nowadays, in fact, there is a kind of transformation of the understanding of the traditional posture of the Golgigen. So now, if you interview people, they will tell you that Golgigen are in fact the equivalent of homosexual. And for example, the gay community in Senegal refuse to call themselves Golgigen, and they will use the term MSN, men who have sex with other men. So, which is really related with prevention issue. So, we see that in fact also through a kind of new discourse on homosexuality, also the signification of the Golgigen inside the society changed during the past years, it's really recent somehow, because it's, since the years 2000. So we have really this change concerning the identity. I hope, yeah.
Many thanks, Aminata, for these responses and for the fascinating presentation. And I think we will have to move to the next presenter. Ahora necesitamos, o me permite presentar la última presentación de esta mañana. Entonces, de nuevo, muchas gracias. Many thanks to Aminata. And the last presentation, which will complement this morning, is by Christine Scherer, who is a professor and a coordinator of BIXAS. By training, an anthropologist who has worked for many years on different kind of things related to objects and exhibition and museum, etc., in different sense. But today her talk or her presentation will be more thinking about the possibilities of indigenous knowledge. And so I will pass the words to Christine. Bueno, tal vez introduzco muy breve en español. Christine es una profesora y coordinadora de BIXAS, del Centro de Investigación en la Universidad de Bayreuth, y es antropóloga por la formación, pero también está en últimos años trabajando sobre la idea de conocimiento indígena, y yo creo que eso va a ser el tema para la reflexión del día de hoy. Bueno, so.
Many thanks for this kind introduction, and also many thanks to the speakers this morning before me. And I really feel somehow confirmed in what I have been contributing to the last years in academia, the last decade actually. And I think, yeah, this is now really bringing you out of a context which has been connected from the concrete to the very, very theoretical aspects of literature. My task is now to use actually the idea and concept of this conference in order to bring it together with what actually I experienced here during the last 2 days, for which I'm really, really grateful, and also to bring it to the sphere between indigenous knowledge and higher education and the space actually we all live in or work in, sometimes even live in. Okay. This sentence has its validity for this talk on 2 levels. Relativity is a relative idea. Terms and terminologies and the cognition and experience combined with it are absolutely not the same in distinct regions of our world. But the dialogue between Africa, the Americas, and Europe offered me not only new insights, but a new understanding of its relevance for our endeavors as social scientists to understand the world around us. And it puts our own assumptions into new relations and of creating knowledge, as it once and again confirms to the fact that our knowledge as academics, with our ways and modes to generate it, is localized itself and in its own sense. We are all practitioners in a field of power, and we should never stop thinking about our own roles in this, as, and now I quote Arjun Appadurai, as the first and the last locus, the human body in the context, and we should never stop thinking about that this sphere of production of meanings in the distinct global fields, in the distinct social fields in a global project called modernity. The talk I want to give is Indigenous Knowledge as a No Space and Cultural Category, some theoretical reflections. And I need to say that this is, of course, not my own work. Actually, this is a collaborative work in progress with a colleague who actually came to Bayreuth in 2008 and did his doctorate there. So Bixis was growing with him and many, many others, that some of them are here now. And with their reflections and their input in our environment in Bayreuth, the environment in Bayreuth really also changed. And we documented that in the prolongation proposal for Bixis, because some of the research areas that we had before changed because of the input of our young academics from Africa. So this is Abraham, and I would love to have him speaking here instead of mine, but it's not the case, so I try to do my best to do justice to this situation. His work is L'intraduisible en question, problématique linguistique africaine et décolonisation conceptuelle, une lecture critique. He's a philosopher, and actually in our work, his experience is already something that helps us a lot. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, it's a bit difficult for me, this multitasking. Okay. Abraham and myself, looking back throughout the years of collaboration, we found very much that it is difficult to find a third space. And this is what actually we are looking for in our endeavors. Because we are elaborating in the rules and norms that define academia today. However, we created such a space where this is now possible and where we can be somewhat undisciplined in the double sense. Abraham is a philosopher, I'm an anthropologist. However, I have a strong focus on higher education studies, and creative practices. He loves semiotics. Last year in July, we had our workshop that, by the way, Abraham called Under the Baobab Tree, in which we were reconceptualizing indigenous knowledge. One of the guests was Edwin Salcedo, activist against racism in Colombia. I'm sure you know him. Okay, now the content of this talk will be first about the indigenous, then about knowledge, then about no spaces, which is a concept we want to introduce, and a dialogue. No spaces is only part of the story, but in order to bring it to a more theoretical level, I would need another talk, and I don't think that is the thing today. Okay. So the indigenous, what is the indigenous? I ask you to kindly keep in mind what I said in the beginning. Our engagement with this theme, Abraham and mine, is localized and referring to the African and the European context. And certainly you will find some stepstones where it's not easy to transfer, but I'm sure you will be able to do that. Already, if we look to what I heard and learned from you since I'm here, the indigenous knowledge is here strictly kept separated from the Afro-descent and descendant knowledge and applied to the indigenas. However, in a talk, I heard the following description. Conocimiento ancestral o tradicional, conjunto de saberes, prácticas, usos, costumbres, informaciones y formas de vida que determinan la existencia de un pueblo dentro de su cosmovisión. This definition was given by Olga Lucia Murillo Palacios, who spoke about the example of medicina ancestral para el cuerpo y el alma. So, the concept of indigeneity is associated to the negative experience of marginality. This is what the South African social linguist and director of the Indigenous People of Africa Coordinating Committee mentioned. And I need to go back to the characteristics because here you see that these are provided by the Work Group of Indigenous Affairs. We are quite similar. Self-identification as indigenous peoples at the individual level and accepted by the community as their members. Historical continuity with the pre-colonial and or pre-settler societies. Strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources, distinct social, economic, or political systems, distinct language, culture, and beliefs. Form non-dominant groups of society. Resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and communities. This is one of the characteristics, because if you go through the literature and through whatever is concerned with indigenous knowledge, you will not find one certain and one clear definition, which is clear after all. What is really very interesting in the whole debate is that the indigenous as such is not easy to define. What obviously seems to be defined much easier is the indigenous peoples, so the connection to human beings. So the United Nations, and we know from Mara's talk, they have quite some influence. It says in its program, indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. Despite their cultural differences, indigenous peoples from around the world share common problems related to the protection of their rights, as distinct peoples. Indigenous peoples have sought recognition of their identities, way of life, and their right to traditional lands, territories, and natural resources for years. Yet, throughout history, their rights have always been violated. I leave the rest to you because I want to just remind you that such top-down definitions in the programs also dominate what is happening in the countries, as we learned by the study of Mara. I now come to the term knowledge, which is even more difficult to talk about. And instead of giving you any kind of characteristics of knowledge, I would just ask these questions. Why is it, why are we? That I think would go to metaphysics. And what should we do? I think that applies quite to ethics. And how can we know? That is what we do as social scientists, the epistemological point of view. The three fundamental questions of philosophy are these, as far as I'm informed, and I think it helps us to really think about how, why, and what we produce as knowledge. While the first two questions are well known in any cultural context, as I would say as anthropologists, the third question is a big question in science as we know them today. The reflections on and the revision of immanent logics of strictly evidence-based knowledge production, methodological repertoires, is part of what we do in our studies as social scientists. But every insight is based, I would say, on sensory data that is already filtered and unconsciously interpreted by the limited biological perceptual apparatus. There can be no absolutely sure knowledge. The rendering of reality, therefore, always remains a hypothetical model. In other words, we can try to be objective, but certainly we are not. Now I bring the two terms together, and this has been caused a lot of discussion in our work group and in the conference, as you can imagine. And that was also a lot of fun, but it also causes, of course, clashes. So I really enjoy this because I think this is what makes it vital and gives us things to learn. The approach of the United Nations again and the World Bank, indigenous knowledge. The UNESCO says local or indigenous knowledge refers to the understanding, skills, and philosophies developed by societies with long histories of interaction with their natural surroundings. For rural and indigenous people, local knowledge informs decision-making about fundamental aspects of day-to-day life. This knowledge is integral to a culture complex that also encompasses language, systems of classification, resources, use, practices, social interactions, ritual, and spirituality. These unique ways of knowing are important facets of the world's cultural diversity and provide a foundation for locally appropriate sustainable development. I think the rhetoric in this direction is very well known to all of us, and I think it's very interesting to see how it goes together on a policy level, a global policy level. So in order to do justice to my colleague who is a geographer, I would just quote from this encyclopedia. Indigenous knowledge is defined as knowledge which is spatially and or culturally context specific, collective, holistic, and adaptive. Although it was previously largely ignored in the fields of development and conservation, indigenous knowledge is currently living a revival, and its incorporation into development processes is seen as essential. After we went through a lot of literature definitions and whatsoever, I would like to introduce a concept that I said is part of a bigger project, and This is called the no spaces. So during the summer school here in Cali, I found a multitude of narratives about distinct and highly complex no spaces. This is the term that Abraham and I found adequate to operate with in our work in progress, because it helps us to understand distinct spheres of knowledge and their interconnectedness. Now I want to give you the definition of the indigenous as a no space. Production, reception, distribution of knowledge via particular methods and performative conventions in structures which are occurring naturally in a particular region or environment. So this is indigenous as a no-scape. And now I come a bit provocative, but I hope we can discuss that later, to science as a no-scape. Production, reception, distribution of knowledge via particular methods and performative conventions in structures which are occurring naturally in a particular region or environment. When Bixes was opened 2007, we had one of the most renowned philosophers from Africa with us to give the inaugural speech. He said, "The study of Africa, as developed so far by a long intellectual tradition, is part of an overall project of knowledge accumulation, initiated and controlled by the West. Kontanji advocates an active, lucid, responsible appropriation by African societies themselves of the knowledge capitalized over centuries about them. He advocates the development in Africa of an autonomous, self-reliant tradition of research and knowledge that addresses problems and issues directly or indirectly posed by Africans. It calls upon epistemologies du Sud." And I think the discourse about that is all well known to you. It calls upon African scholars in African studies and in all other disciplines to understand that they have been doing so far, a kind of research that was massively extroverted, externally oriented, intended first and foremost to meet the theoretical and practical needs of Northern societies. It invites a new orientation and new ambitions for research by Africans in Africa. And he asks, how African are the so-called African studies? How African are the so-called African studies? By African history, for instance, we usually mean the historical discourse on or about Africa, and not necessarily a historical discourse coming from Africa or produced by Africans. In grammatical terms, we mean the history of Africa, Historia Africae, in Latin, where Africae, the genitive of Africa, would be said to be an objective genitive rather than a subjective genitive. In the same line, African sociology or anthropology means the sociology or anthropology of Africa is an objective genitive that is a sociological or anthropological discourse on Africa, and not a sociological and anthropology tradition developed by Africans within Africa. Now I come to my next point, the dialogue. I think the name of this conference is a crucial issue in our exchange, and that we are able to lead this dialogue and this kind of dialogue where Africa, America, and Europe comes together is really something else. And I think we should say thank you to the organizers, and I am really feeling privileged about this kind of dialogue. However, in the context of sorry, in all kinds of dialogue, we know that social reality is never ever completely precisely described and functionally unambiguously and operates in isolation. In the context of this, the argument of Abraham and myself are that we are in a way all indigenous, that the acknowledgement of knowledge existing in distinct no spaces is crucial for any dialogue, that a relational dialogue integrates no spaces of all sorts with their own methodologies whose interaction need to be supported by translators, so people who know how to translate. That creative process of knowledge production needs to leave their comfort zones in order not to perpetuate the status quo in social contexts and fields. And we argue that clashes on the edge of these conventions of established no spaces are really necessary. And we argue that humanities and social sciences are important facilitators to create third spaces where this is possible until it might be established. And instead of giving you a conclusion, I give no conclusion and say, muchas gracias por su atención.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Many thanks to Christine for this very interesting and I think also kind of provocative or opening presentation. So any question, comments that would like to follow up?
Thank you very much. I really appreciated